front end. It takes much more preparation to think of what to say when you don't have the benefit of all the thinking from all the experts that normally attend this conference. So I've always found this, Phil, to be a very important conference, and I hope you're able to continue it for many, many more years. Originally, we were planning to have Danny Sepulveda, Ambassador Danny Sepulveda, here with me. He runs the Communications and Information Policy Program at the State Department, where he coordinates international policy in this space. And we were going to do a little fireside chat or whatever Phil calls it here. But unfortunately, Danny has to head out of the country for meetings of our Western Hemisphere region on a lot of these issues and couldn't join us today. But I'll try to make up for that by quoting him liberally at times in the speech. Today, I want to focus on the challenges that we face to maintain a free and open internet in the wake of these unauthorized disclosures of U.S. surveillance practices. Now, President Obama addressed the national intelligence ramifications of these practices on January the 17th, so I'm not going to talk about those today. But what I do want to talk about is our response to the fact that these disclosures have damaged the trust of the government and, by extension, the trust of U.S. companies. And it's now having significant economic impacts on these businesses and is threatening the free and open internet, and in particular, the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance that has served us so well over the years. Now, let me say at the outset that the events of the last several months have not altered the administration's support for a free and open internet. Global trade relies on the continued open flow of data, and cutting off or disrupting these flows will cause significant economic damage and could impede technological advancement and innovation, which rely on global cooperation. So we cannot let the surveillance issues jeopardize this. There's too much at stake. But we do have work to do to rebuild the trust of consumers worldwide in the internet and in the American companies that provide so many important and beneficial services over the internet. We have work to do to discourage the building of barriers on the internet to disrupt the free flow of information. And we have work to do to reduce and eliminate the threat to the existing multi-stakeholder processes of internet governance. So I'm going to talk about each of these challenges and what we are doing, particularly at the Department of Commerce and NTIA, to meet them. To address the loss of trust, we continued to focus on the protection of consumer privacy. One of the strongest reactions to the unauthorized disclosures has come from foreign governments and consumers. Now, the President addressed this concern directly in his policy directive in January, which states that all persons should be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their nationality or wherever they might reside. And as he stated in his speech, citizens in other countries need to have confidence that the United States respects their privacy. Now, there has been a particular focus in Europe, which is the biggest foreign revenue source for U.S. online companies. Governments and consumers in Europe have expressed strong concerns that their data are not protected as well as we protect data of U.S. users. Information flows between Europe and the United States are governed by the U.S. European Union Safe Harbor framework. Now, we've heard calls from members of the European Parliament to suspend this framework. But in our work with the European Union, the Union last year issued a series of recommendations to the United States not to suspend the Safe Harbor framework, but to find ways to improve that framework. At Commerce, our colleagues in the International Trade Administration, along with the Federal Trade Commission, are working with the European Commission to negotiate these recommendations. The first sessions went well last month, and discussions will resume this week. And recently, the FTC announced a number of important enforcement actions against companies who are not complying with their safe harbor obligations, thus demonstrating the continuing commitment of the United States to take seriously the privacy interests of European citizens. A broader privacy issue emerging from the unauthorized disclosures is how changes in technology are challenging our conceptions of privacy. In his speech, the President asked his counselor, John Podesta, to lead a comprehensive review of big data and privacy and how it will affect the way we live and work. Now, we all know that the growth of the digital economy has been accompanied by an explosion of information. And as John Podesta stated in a blog post after the president's speech, we're undergoing a revolution in the way information about our purchases, our conversations, our social networks, our movements, and even our physical identities are collected, stored, analyzed, and used. And when we talk about big data, we must address both the exponential increase in collection capabilities, including the expansion of sensing devices, as well as the significant advancements in computing power and analytic capabilities that allow us to discover unanticipated facts from a variety of disparate data sources. So we've announced a 90-day work effort, which will culminate in a report to articulate key questions in this space and to identify where further research and action may be required. The President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology will conduct its own parallel study to explore the technological dimensions of the intersection of big data and privacy, which will feed into this broader effort. One important issue for us from the overall project will be whether our current policy framework, which was set forth in the President's blueprint on consumer data privacy 2 years ago, needs to be modified in any way in light of these technological advances. I think in the last week or two, the Center for Democracy and Technology released a paper postulating that the traditional framework for information privacy, which was largely what we adopted in the President's Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, can be applied to the challenges of big data, but may need to be reinterpreted. So it is good to see that this debate is already started. Now, in addition to this work, NTIA continues its own work to implement the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. This past week, we launched a new effort to bring together industry, academics, consumer groups, and others to tackle the privacy challenges posed by the commercial uses of facial recognition technology. Facial recognition technology is being embedded into social network services, kiosks in stores, and access systems. And online services are using facial recognition software to help consumers organize their personal photos, and video games are using face prints to customize the gaming experience. But these innovative uses of this new technology raise novel privacy questions, such as how to ensure consumers are given sufficient notice that their biometric data are being collected and stored, and how to provide consumers with appropriate control over their data. And through the multi-stakeholder process we started last week, we hope that parties will come together to develop a voluntary code of conduct to give consumers trust in this new technology. And this latest effort follows an important milestone we reached last summer when stakeholders agreed to begin testing and implementing the first code of conduct focused on mobile app transparency. And already we're seeing companies that are implementing some of that aspects of the first code in their offering of mobile applications. Let me turn to the second concern, which is the building of barriers to disrupt the free flow of information. Some governments reacted to the unauthorized disclosures by increasing their attempts to control or regulate the internet, or to require companies to store data or locate hardware within their countries. Erecting such barriers is reactionary and short-sighted, and such actions threaten to fragment the global internet and to disrupt the economic growth that flows from an open internet. Eric Schmidt of Google has opined that this balkanization of the internet would be a very bad thing, and that it would really break the way the internet works. A recent study by the Boston Consulting Group posits the concept of e-friction, which is a set of 55 factors that might inhibit online interactions and exchange. Sources of e-friction include the level and quality of broadband access, the level of digital literacy among a country's citizens, and the availability of capital. But the list also includes national policies towards openness and the free flow of information. And the conclusion of the analysis, not surprisingly, is that the digital economy accounts for a larger share of overall economic activity in low-friction countries than it does in high-friction countries. A separate report on localization barriers to trade by the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation goes deeper and finds that localization barriers can damage the countries that use them. by raising the costs of key capital goods and by isolating the countries from participation in the global economy. And it may be perhaps that the growing recognition that such economically inefficient policies will harm the countries that adopt them will quell some of the initial enthusiasm countries showed for implementing these barriers. But all of us must work together to educate countries about the threats of such measures and oppose them where we can. Next, let me address the renewed global challenges to Internet governance, and specifically the multi-stakeholder model of Internet policy making. Now, I've spoken about multi-stakeholder and multi-stakeholder process every year I've been here since 2010, so I won't spend much time reviewing the concept today. But basically, for those of you who may not be as familiar with it, the multi-stakeholder model allows all interested parties, such as industry, civil society, government, technical experts, to participate as equals to solve policy issues. And the idea is that by encouraging the participation of all interested parties, multi-stakeholder processes can encourage broader and more creative problem solving. Now, for years there's been a debate as to whether government should control Internet decision-making instead of these multi-stakeholder bodies. This debate came to the fore at the World Conference of International Telecommunications in Dubai at the end of 2012. And as I told this conference a year ago, we have an ongoing challenge to convince countries of the benefits of the multi-stakeholder process. We need to focus on those nations, largely in the developing world, that want the benefits of the Internet to grow their economies and create wealth for their citizens. Now, they have issues, such as how to maintain sustainable investment in their infrastructure, and they are legitimately concerned about the online problems of spam, child pornography, and the like. Many would be open to solving these problems through means such as a multi-stakeholder process, but they're just not comfortable enough with this form of governance to join in. This year could be a watershed year in the global acceptance of multi-stakeholder policymaking. Last year, the leaders of the Internet technical community, called the ISTARs, this is ICANN, IETF, ISOC, came together to spearhead an international campaign to craft Internet governance principles and to propose a roadmap for further evolution of Internet governance. In December, a high-level panel on global Internet governance chaired by the President of Estonia and including members from around the world convened in London to study these issues and provide thoughts on the evolution of Internet governance. The group will be issuing a draft report in early March, which then leads into a meeting that the Brazilian government is hosting in April, which it is calling the Global Multi-Stakeholder Meeting on the Future of Internet Governance. Later in the year, Minister Ed Vaizey at the United Kingdom will host a high-level ministerial meeting in connection with the London ICANN meeting, at which these issues will be discussed. And then in late summer, the Internet Governance Forum in Istanbul, Turkey will provide yet an additional opportunity for global discussions. I am somewhat hopeful that these developments will ultimately reinforce support for the multi-stakeholder model and contribute to its positive evolution. For example, if after the wicket you had told me that by February of 2014, Brazil would be demonstrating global leadership to protect and expand the multi-stakeholder model of Internet governance, I would have been a little incredulous, but I would have been very, very happy. And frankly, we shouldn't be surprised that Brazil is taking this role because of its strong tradition of multi-stakeholder Internet policy making within the country. But notwithstanding the concerns Brazil has raised about the surveillance disclosures, it has invited the United States to be a member of the high-level coordinating committee to plan the conference. We've accepted that invitation, and Ambassador Sepulveda will represent us on that committee. So far, we are impressed with the open and inclusive process Brazil has instituted to plan for this meeting. And as Ambassador Sepulveda said in a recent speech, the meeting holds promise in advancing the global community's understanding of Internet governance if the agenda is developed in a truly multi-stakeholder fashion, participation at the meeting is broad and inclusive, and if any follow-on activity is guided by and ultimately supported by the multi-stakeholder system rather than an intergovernmental mechanism of centrally imposed regulations or mandates. So it's encouraging to see a broad coalition of Internet shareholders addressing these challenges in the spirit and tradition of the multi-stakeholder process. We appreciate the leadership being shown by Brazil and hope that their involvement attracts the engagement of many other countries in the developing world. We are willing to work collectively with all of them to make Internet governance and multi-stakeholder governance more inclusive while maintaining the stability of the open and innovative Internet. In all of these activities, the Department of Commerce, and especially my agency, NTIA, will be directly engaged. And as Secretary Penny Pritzker told the State of the Net conference a couple of weeks ago, the Commerce Department will serve as the chief federal champion for good Internet policy that supports entrepreneurs, businesses, and consumers. And on all of these issues, we need and ask for your partnership and input to ensure that our policies are well thought out and nimble enough to respond to this quickly evolving environment. So I and the rest of our folks at the department look forward to working with you on these important issues. And I thank you for listening.
Take a couple of questions, one of whom will come from a student. And again, I'm not afraid to call on people, just like Paul.
Calling our former intern. I see him up there somewhere.
Go for it. And there's an expression that helps explain this that calls no good deed goes unpunished. So Brad Rivera, for those who haven't met Brad.
Okay, so my question is...
By the way, that's the irony, of course. They all have great questions. They're just waiting for someone else to ask them. So go ahead, Brad.
With a lot of the spectrum auctions coming up, what is the NTIA's role this year in terms of some of the initiatives that are coming up?
Spectrum. Okay. Well, we've got some major auctions coming up later this year at the FCC of the 1755 to 1780 spectrum and hopefully the 1695 to 1710 spectrum, which again is planned for, although I don't think there's been as much industry interest in that band as there has been in 1755. So the process right now is that all of the agencies have now completed draft transition plans. Those under the law have to be reviewed in 30 days by a technical panel consisting of OMB, NTIA, and the FCC. If any of the plans are not adequate, the agency has to go back and augment them. We're hoping that because the way the law is written, if somebody really has to go back and start over, it threatens the actual auction dates. So we're hoping people's plans are in good shape or can be fixed with a minimum amount of extra time. And then that information will be out of the plans, gets released to the bidders later in the year and hopefully leads to a very successful auction in the fall. In addition to that, working with the FCC, we continue to look at other bands. 5 gigahertz has been very interesting and very important because of the possibility of expanding unlicensed spectrum. And that's wrapped up in some of the preparations for work 2015 as people do some of the work on that. And the FCC has previously issued an NPRM on the 3.5 gigahertz band, and I know they're planning a further rulemaking on that this year as a way to try out some other ways to allow both government use and industry use to work together in the same band through this idea of sharing. Sharing is really the new paradigm for spectrum reallocation, and it's one that we're going to be spending a lot of time on internally. We've taken our facility here in Boulder at ITS and will be in a virtual merger working with the NIST facilities out here to create the Center for Advanced Communications to perform research on the technical aspects of spectrum sharing and to be able to serve as a neutral party for both federal agencies and for industry to get testing and analysis of how federal systems can interact with the different commercial systems that might emerge in some of these bands.
So for those who aren't in the spectrum world, you probably don't appreciate how interesting and a big deal all those points Larry just touched on actually is. And for those who haven't been aware of Silicon Flatiron Spectrum Initiative, you need to talk to Pierre DeVries over here. The work around spectrum property rights and developing a harm claim threshold is really important because as we have less spectrum we have to use less spectrum is free to be used. It's all been allocated. We have to find more innovative ways, and Pierre's done great work. We'll also have a conference for those who like boundary jumping, comparing property rights in spectrum with property rights in water and mineral rights. And the keynote speaker will be Richard Epstein, who's really a wonderful law professor who's fascinating, and we'll get to wrap it all up in Larry's traditional role at the end. One more
Can I
question.
just speak to that?
Yeah,
So, again, we're getting a little into the weeds on this stuff, but there's a really fascinating question out there in terms of creating incentives for federal agencies. And quite honestly, a lot of the work that's been done is kind of been done where people kind of have the idea and don't let the facts get in the way. I know that this spectrum coordinating panel at the White House is going to be putting out a report later this spring on incentives, seeking public comment. And I really urge people to really get in and learn how this works and then give us your ideas. For example, this issue of property rights. Federal agencies have no property rights in the spectrum they use. They get an assignment. What that allows us to do at NTIA is to put dozens of agencies and hundreds of assignments in the same band. If you were to try to now come back and impose on that some sense of property rights, first off, I think you would create some very terrible disincentives to get federal agencies to hoard spectrum, to take more than they need because of the possibility that somebody might pay them later on. But you also have this tremendous transactional cost problem, which is when you want to open up a band for commercial use, how do you deal with 32 agencies and 3,000 assignments? And so these are some of the practical issues that have to be addressed, and we look and encourage people to really get in and understand what the facts are and then figure out how to apply that to some of these theories about incentives that have been around for years.
All right, we want a question, or else we're going to keep going deeper on this topic. Winston, last question here.
Thanks. Winston Maxwell, Hogan Lovells in Paris. When we talk about the free and open internet, we think immediately about China and Iran and regimes that have very restrictive policies. But France and other countries have mechanisms to block, for example, access to illegal gambling sites. Is that, from your point of view, is that a threat to the free and open internet, those sort of laws?
Well, not necessarily, but they have to be taken in context. In other words, there are issues of crime on the internet just as there is crime in society, and our law enforcement agencies have to be able to deal with those without respect to the environment in which the crimes are being performed. But I think as we find solutions for those things in terms of ferreting out that illegal behavior and then being able to identify the culprits and punish them, we have to be very sensitive to what techniques are being used and how they may upset these larger issues of free flow of information. So the perfect example of that here in the United States from a couple of years ago was the debate on SOPA and PIPA that we had, where you had proposals from the content community, I think some of which there was absolute consensus would work and should be adopted, including things like, focusing on the credit card companies that enable some of these illegal websites, focusing on advertisers who advertise on some of these sites. Those didn't present issues to the fundamental plumbing of the internet. But there's a third one about insisting that intermediaries act to block access to some of the content, and those issues raised a lot of very serious issues that at the time the community didn't think had been well thought through, and as a result the legislation failed because of a general reaction from the public just denying the content community the benefit of some of those processes and measures that probably would have helped them over this other issue. So I think as we approach these, we just have to be dealing with them in this larger context of doing things that may upset this other balance in terms of how the internet works and trying to get as specific as we can in terms of how to deal with them. So I think that's the best response to your point.
All right, as promised, we now have a break. Enjoy it, and we'll bring you back for the opening panel. Thank you, Larry. Oh, Larry, we got a picture up here.
Hold on, he's got to get his coat. There we go.
Troublemaker, right?
Huh?
You know he's a